What if some of old Hollywood's most beloved legends weren't just captivating and talented, but also, at times, hilariously and unmistakably dim-witted? Today, we dive into the stories of classic Hollywood figures who, according to their closest companions, media accounts, and even their own spouses, were surprisingly lacking in common sense. Johnny Weissmuller. Before the bright lights of Hollywood found him, Johnny Weissmuller was a celebrated Olympic swimmer, boasting 5 gold medals and a bronze by 1932. MGM swiftly recognized his rugged charm and cast him as Tarzan, turning his primal jungle yell into pure box office magic. However, once the cameras stopped, Weissmuller's intelligence, or the lack thereof, became a punchline within the studio walls. Studio insiders revealed that Weissmuller often struggled with reading scripts and memorizing his lines. Director W.S. Van Dyke reportedly had to simplify scenes for him, focusing more on physical action than dialogue. Known for ad-libbing nonsensical grunts whenever he forgot his lines, crew members jokingly remarked, "We just let him swing." A 1940 Variety article even commented, "He was better with the rope than the script." Despite his impressive earnings, Weissmuller made a series of catastrophic financial choices, pouring money into failed hotel ventures and ill-advised business schemes, including a bizarre attempt to open a chain of Tarzan-themed restaurants. By the 1960s, his fortune was gone. Friends described him as lovable but painfully naive. His personal life mirrored his impulsive tendencies, marked by 5 marriages, including one spontaneous proposal to a woman he had just met at a nightclub. In his final years, living in a Las Vegas hotel, he was often seen wandering the halls in his robe, still calling himself Tarzan. Although fame made him an immortal icon, it couldn't hide the profound lack of self-awareness that characterized his real life. Ed Wood. No discussion about poor decision-making in Hollywood would be complete without mentioning Edward Davis Wood Jr. A filmmaker driven by passion and convinced of his own genius, Wood had an imagination that far outstripped his actual abilities. His 1959 movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space, is often dubbed the worst film ever made. In one of his most infamous moves, he cast the ailing silent film legend Bela Lugosi shortly before his death, later replacing him with a much taller actor, who kept his face hidden beneath a cape. His flying saucers were literally paper plates dangling on visible strings. Despite all evidence, Wood insisted he was creating high art. Former colleagues recalled how Wood often shot entire scenes without checking if they were even in focus, and his scripts were littered with grammatical blunders and bewildering plot holes. Actor Paul Marco once noted that Wood truly believed every word he wrote was pure Shakespeare. According to Rudolph Gray's biography, Nightmare of Ecstasy, Wood remained eternally optimistic and delusional, convinced that his failures were simply misunderstood works of genius. He never acknowledged his own flaws and frequently blamed critics for failing to appreciate his brilliance. Wood died in 1978, destitute and forgotten, surviving on cheap whiskey and typewritten dreams. Although cult fame eventually found him posthumously, it arrived far too late to change the reality. Ed Wood wasn't just a bad filmmaker. He was a man tragically unaware that he lacked the basic tools to realize the empire he dreamed of building. Jane Mansfield. With a reported IQ of 163, fluency in 5 languages, and the ability to play classical violin, Jane Mansfield had all the makings of a genuine intellectual. Yet she chose to base her entire career around the persona of the ditzy blonde, embracing the stereotypes so convincingly that even powerful studio executives believed the act was real. The real tragedy wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was how Mansfield weaponized her faux foolishness to ascend the Hollywood ladder, only to have it collapse beneath her. From the moment she exploded onto the scene in the 1950s, Mansfield captivated tabloids with scandalous stunts, wardrobe malfunctions, champagne-filled bathtubs, and interviews laced with cheeky one-liners. Her outrageous antics overshadowed any hope of being taken seriously as an actress. When she starred in films like The Girl Can't Help It and Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, critics largely dismissed her performances as exaggerated parodies. Biographer Martha Saxton and other insiders pointed out that Mansfield frequently sabotaged her own future in the industry. She once rejected a prestigious Broadway revival role simply because it didn't guarantee television exposure. While filming Promises, Hollywood's first major nude film, she prioritized shock value over developing her character, further cementing her reputation as a novelty act rather than a serious artist. Behind the scenes, her life spiraled into reckless choices. Her tumultuous marriage to bodybuilder Mickey Hargitay ended in a messy legal battle. She also gravitated toward bizarre associations, including her infamous connection with Anton LaVey of the Church of Satan, and surrounded herself with sensationalist publicity stunts. At the height of her fame, she appeared in a string of incoherent, low-budget European films, hastening her career decline. Tragically, her accidental death in 1967 immortalized her public image, not as a brilliant woman trapped by Hollywood's narrow vision, but as a tragic figure who clung so tightly to the dumb blonde caricature that she couldn't escape it when the tide turned. Wallace Berry. Wallace Berry reigned as one of MGM's most bankable stars during the 1930s, captivating audiences with his rugged charm and lumbering screen presence. His performance in The Champ, 1931, even earned him an Academy Award. However, within Hollywood circles, whispers circulated, not about his acting talent, but about his limited intellect and volatile temper. Berry's reputation for being difficult on set became legendary. Directors often lamented his inability to grasp complex directions, forcing screenwriters to rewrite his scripts to eliminate emotional nuances and complicated dialogue. According to The Fixers by E.J. Fleming, studio records reveal that Berry would memorize his lines phonetically, often without comprehending their meaning. Joan Crawford, after enduring his abusive behavior during the filming of Grand Hotel, allegedly confided to a friend, "He was cruel, stupid, and arrogant." Other actors, like Jackie Cooper, recalled physical mistreatment at Berry's hands. In an interview, Cooper shared that Berry once pinched him during scenes to make him cry authentically on camera. Off the set, Berry's choices bordered on the absurd. He invested heavily in ostrich farms and novelty candy shops, convinced they were future gold mines. When asked to speak on political matters at a studio event, he reportedly responded, "I ain't got time for them kind of thinking." Even at the peak of his fame, MGM executives viewed him as difficult and intellectually limited, valuing him more for his consistent box office appeal than for any personal or artistic depth. Wallace Berry's legacy lives on not because of insight or brilliance, but because brute force and gruff charisma sometimes masquerade as talent in Hollywood. George Raft. George Raft had the looks, voice, and tough guy demeanor that epitomized gangster cinema of the 1930s. Before Humphrey Bogart rose to fame, Raft was the ultimate on-screen criminal. Yet where Bogart's career soared, Raft's faltered, not from lack of opportunities, but from an almost comedic string of terrible decisions. Growing up in Hell's Kitchen, Raft's real-life connections to organized crime opened the door to Hollywood. He could dance, brawl, and wear a fedora like it was second nature. But according to multiple biographies, including Louis Yablonsky's The Gangster Life, Raft rarely bothered to read scripts in their entirety. Instead, he picked roles based on how tough the character appeared, famously rejecting parts where the dialogue didn't sound manly enough. His most notorious blunders include turning down The Maltese Falcon, a role that catapulted Bogart to superstardom, and rejecting Casablanca, which he dismissed as a weird little war picture. He also passed on Double Indemnity because he was uncomfortable playing morally ambiguous characters. Studio heads grew increasingly frustrated. A 1942 memo from Warner Brothers described Raft as consistently uncooperative and alarmingly short-sighted. Raft's personal life further cemented his reckless reputation. His close friendships with notorious gangsters like Bugsy Siegel and Frank Costello, along with his love of underground gambling, consistently endangered his career. When questioned about his choices, Raft shrugged and said, "I go with what I know." Ultimately, George Raft's promising career faded into obscurity, eclipsed by the very actors who accepted the roles he foolishly rejected. He wasn't remembered for what he did, but for the opportunities he repeatedly let slip through his fingers. Buster Crabbe. Clarence Linden. Buster Crabbe was America's golden boy of 1932, winning a gold medal in the 400-meter freestyle at the Summer Olympics. With his athletic frame and striking looks, Hollywood quickly beckoned. He became an iconic screen hero, portraying characters like Tarzan, Flash Gordon, and Buck Rogers. Yet behind the rugged exterior was a man who never truly understood the entertainment industry's evolving demands. In later interviews, Crabbe admitted he never read full scripts, focusing instead on physical stunts over character development. On the set of Flash Gordon, his dialogue was often dubbed in post-production due to repeated mistakes during filming. Director Frederick Steffani had to construct scenes with minimal dialogue to accommodate Crabbe's shortcomings. Despite repeated success in serial films, Crabbe resisted moving into more demanding, dramatic roles. He firmly believed audiences wanted to see him only as an action figure. As historian Richard Bond observed in Serial Kings, Crabbe stagnated because he thought growth was unnecessary. His financial decisions mirrored this simplistic mindset. He invested heavily in a chain of backyard swimming pool franchises, only to face bankruptcy due to legal disputes and poor management. Later, when offered a television revival of Flash Gordon in the 1950s, he initially demanded creative control, only to lose interest halfway through development, forcing producers to salvage the project. Buster Crabbe's decline wasn't marred by scandal, but by his quiet refusal to adapt. He remained loyal to his aging action hero image, even as public tastes evolved. In an industry that demands reinvention, he remained frozen, making flashy entrances but all too often wooden exits. Esther Williams. Esther Williams glittered as Hollywood's million-dollar mermaid, dazzling 1940s and 1950s audiences with her water ballets, intricate swimming choreography, and radiant beauty. Her aquatic musicals, packed with synchronized routines and elaborate sets, became a staple of MGM's golden age. Yet beyond the shimmering surface, Williams showed little interest in the inner workings of her fame or the swiftly changing film industry. Though athletic, charming, and camera-ready, Williams was never known for her intellectual curiosity. In her memoir, The $1 Million Mermaid, she confessed that she rarely read her scripts fully before arriving on set. She even quipped, "If it doesn't involve a pool, I'm not interested." Directors like Charles Walters often had to craft scenes centered entirely around her physical strengths, minimizing any requirement for nuanced acting. Her personal life mirrored her casual approach to her career. Williams married 4 times, most notably to actor Fernando Lamas, who demanded she abandon her career. When asked in a 1984 interview why she agreed, she simply replied, "He was strong. I liked strong." Friends often remarked on her lack of business savvy, particularly when she turned down lucrative television opportunities, dismissing TV as beneath her even as film roles dwindled. Williams's entrepreneurial ventures fared no better. Her swimwear line collapsed due to poor management and ineffective marketing strategies. By the late 1960s, she found herself financially insecure and struggling to regain relevance. She failed to reinvent herself in an industry that rewarded constant evolution. Esther Williams was never labeled unintelligent, but her indifference to anything beyond surface-level glamour ultimately sealed her fate. When MGM's water tanks dried up, so too did her stardom, as she drifted quietly away from the spotlight. Milton Burl. Milton Burley was a dominant force in 1950s television, earning the nickname Mr. Television for his groundbreaking work in early broadcast comedy. As the host of Texaco Star Theater, he captivated over 80% of the national audience at his peak. However, despite his enormous success, Burley was infamous for making egotistical and reckless decisions that steadily eroded his reputation and career. One of his worst habits was joke theft, an open secret in the comedy world. He frequently borrowed material from other comedians, often recycling vaudeville-era routines that had long since lost their relevance. Writers working on his show often complained that he insisted on using outdated gags, refusing to modernize his act. When CBS executives pushed for updates to keep up with changing tastes, Burl flatly refused. "This is what made me famous," he argued, even as ratings plummeted. Backstage, his erratic behavior alienated colleagues. Biographers like Gerald Nachman in Seriously Funny recount how Burley demanded full script approval, despite rarely bothering to read them, and impulsively fired writers over trivial disagreements. His instincts often led him astray. He rejected format changes, fearing they would diminish his spotlight, and refused to collaborate with emerging comedic talents, believing they might overshadow him. His business decisions were equally disastrous. He turned down a lucrative MGM film contract simply because he didn't want to cut back on nightclub performances, missing a golden opportunity to transition into movies. In 1960, he invested in a chain of comedy clubs under his own name, but refused to visit or promote them, leading to their collapse within 2 years. despite playing a crucial role in shaping television comedy. Milton Burl failed to grasp that staying relevant required growth, adaptation, and occasionally stepping aside for new talent. He never embraced change, and as a result, his once monumental career faded into irrelevance. Frank Fay. Once regarded as one of America's greatest stage comedians, Frank Fay commanded vaudeville and Broadway audiences in the 1920s with his impeccable timing and powerful stage presence. However, behind the curtain, Fay was a toxic blend of arrogance, prejudice, and shocking social ignorance. He didn't just sabotage his own career, he alienated an entire industry that had once celebrated him. Fay's early success convinced him he was untouchable. During his stint at Warner Brothers, studio memos noted that he was notoriously difficult to direct. He ignored cues, rewrote scripts without permission, and openly mocked crew members. George Burns once described him as the funniest man who ever lived, and the most detestable human being I ever met. Off stage, his behavior was even worse. At a time when Hollywood, largely run by Jewish executives, was beginning to move away from overt discrimination, Fay made no effort to hide his anti-Semitic and racist views. His drunken tirades in nightclubs frequently made headlines during Prohibition, and he was arrested multiple times for disorderly conduct. His personal life was just as turbulent. His marriage to Barbara Stanwyck ended in divorce due to allegations of physical and emotional abuse. Professionally, he made career-destroying decisions. Believing talkies were beneath him, Fay initially refused roles in sound films. When he finally agreed to star in God's Gift to Women, 1931, his performance was so lifeless that critics tore it apart. By the 1940s, his career had collapsed, and Hollywood no longer wanted anything to do with him. According to biographers like Nick Tosh's, Frank Fay's downfall wasn't due to a lack of talent. It was his inability to see beyond his own ego. By the 1950s, he was performing in second-rate clubs, barely making ends meet. His story is not just one of arrogance, but of a man who mistook applause for invincibility and paid the ultimate price for it. William Frolley, best known for his role as Fred Mertz on I Love Lucy, William Frolley became a beloved television icon. However, behind the scenes, he was an unpredictable and combative presence, whose bad temper and chronic lack of self-awareness often made him his own worst enemy. Before television resurrected his career, Frolley had spent decades struggling as a character actor in Hollywood. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, his reputation for being difficult and unprofessional followed him from studio to studio. His biggest liability was his alcoholism, which frequently led to slurred lines and missed cues. Directors like Wesley Ruggles reportedly refused to work with him after too many wasted takes. He even lost a role in Miracle on 34th Street because he couldn't stay sober long enough to film his scenes properly. His notorious behavior almost cost him the I Love Lucy role. Lucille Ball was initially against casting him, citing his drinking and erratic behavior. However, Desi Arnaz agreed to hire him under one strict condition. He had to remain sober and show up on time. Surprisingly, Frolley followed the rules while filming, but the moment cameras stopped rolling, his old habits returned. He was banned from multiple Hollywood bars due to frequent brawls and public outbursts. Frolley had no patience for modern acting techniques, openly mocking co-stars who took their craft seriously. "If you need to practice, you shouldn't be in this business," he once sneered at a younger actor. His stubbornness and inability to evolve limited his opportunities after I Love Lucy ended, as producers feared he would revert to his reckless ways. While undeniably talented, William Frolley confused belligerence for wisdom and defiance for strength. He coasted on the success of a single role but failed to recognize how easily it all could have slipped away due to his refusal to change. Jean Arthur. With her signature husky voice and expressive eyes, Jean Arthur became one of Hollywood's most beloved leading ladies in the 1930s and 1940s. She shined in classics like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. Yet despite her talent, Arthur spent much of her career running from fame, the press, and even her own success. Arthur's intense fear of public speaking and social interaction was well documented. But beyond mere shyness, she displayed an almost self-sabotaging aversion to Hollywood's inner workings. She avoided interviews, refused public appearances, and rarely engaged with studio executives. Director Frank Capra once described how she would slip out through back exits and disappear between projects, making it nearly impossible to reach her. Her anxiety often disrupted productions. While filming The More the Merrier, Arthur reportedly had breakdowns over lighting and wardrobe choices. She insisted on filming without crew members watching, forcing George Stevens to rebuild entire sets to accommodate her discomfort. Despite earning an Oscar nomination for the film, she later dismissed the experience as miserable. Even more baffling were the roles she turned down. She passed on His Girl Friday, It's a Wonderful Life, and several scripts written specifically for her. In 1944, Columbia Pictures offered her a contract extension, but she rejected it in favor of semi-retirement. With no clear career plan, she faded from the industry on her own terms. Arthur eventually resurfaced as an acting professor at Vassar College in the 1960s. But even there, students found her evasive, cryptic, and emotionally distant. Her brilliance was undeniable, but so was her deep detachment. Unlike other stars who fell from grace due to scandal or bad decisions, Jean Arthur simply drifted away. She didn't lack talent. She lacked the ability, or the desire, to function in the world that made her a star. Rod Steiger garnered immense critical acclaim for his intense, brooding performances in films like On the Waterfront, The Pawnbroker, and In the Heat of the Night. He won an Academy Award and collaborated with some of the finest directors of his generation. However, his extreme commitment to method acting, coupled with emotional instability and poor career decisions, eventually made him a cautionary figure in Hollywood. Steiger's method acting was so immersive that it frequently alienated those he worked with. During the production of Dr. Zhivago, director David Lean reportedly clashed with Steiger over his refusal to rehearse. Stiger insisted on getting into a psychological state before performing, often causing hours-long delays. Omar Sharif described working with him as mentally draining. His perfectionism often slid into self-sabotage. He famously declined the role of General Patton, a performance that would later earn George C. Scott an Oscar, because he felt the script lacked emotional depth. He also rejected The Godfather, deeming it too commercial, a decision he would later publicly regret. Despite his admissions, he continued to favor obscure, incoherent projects that granted him more creative control over mainstream opportunities. In interviews, Steiger frequently blamed the industry for sidelining him, yet colleagues consistently pointed to his erratic mood swings and unwillingness to compromise. Director Sidney Lumet once remarked, "Rod was brilliant, but he made things more difficult than necessary for everyone." In his later years, Steiger battled severe depression and financial instability, taking roles in low-budget foreign films and minor TV appearances merely to survive. He believed the industry had misunderstood him, but failed to recognize how his rigid ideals and towering ego had shut him out from greater opportunities. His tremendous talent ultimately became a prison of his own making. Earl Hollowman. Earl Hollowman entered Hollywood with a promising future, earning a Golden Globe for his role in The Rainmaker in 1956, and sharing the screen with icons like Elvis Presley and John Wayne. Yet despite his early success and undeniable charisma, Hollowman's career ultimately stalled. Those who worked alongside him often described him as pleasant but limited, an actor who never fully understood the necessity of reinvention. Studio memos from the late 1950s reveal Hollowman's reluctance to challenge himself. He repeatedly turned down roles requiring accents or emotional complexity, insisting he was best suited to playing the good old American fella. When approached for a part in Judgment at Nuremberg, he declined, labeling it too political. The role eventually went to William Shatner. Hollowman's acting choices displayed a clear pattern of playing it safe. Directors found themselves frustrated by his resistance to growth. Richard Fleischer, who directed Hollowman in The Trap, later remarked, "He wasn't difficult, he just never stretched himself." Hollowman steered clear of stage acting, refused to train in dialects, and almost exclusively stuck to westerns or war movies. His off-screen business decisions were equally conservative and disastrous. He invested most of his savings into a restaurant venture in Burbank, which folded within 3 years due to poor management. He also rejected television opportunities in the early 60s, believing that film work would always be plentiful. Although Hollowman continued acting in minor roles well into the 1980s, his visibility faded with each passing decade. He was never embroiled in scandal, Nor was he disliked, but his unwillingness to evolve in an industry that rewarded risk led to his quiet fade from relevance. Peter Laurier. Peter Laurier possessed one of the most recognizable faces in cinematic history. Bug-eyed, soft-voiced, with an eerie presence that rendered his performances unforgettable in films like M and The Maltese Falcon. However, the very traits that made him stand out also trapped him in a narrow range of roles. Despite his intelligence and quick wit, Laurier made surprisingly limited career choices, largely driven by insecurity rather than ambition. Arriving in Hollywood in the 1930s after fleeing Nazi Germany, Laurier, who was fluent in several languages and classically trained, nevertheless accepted nearly any role offered to him. Afraid of unemployment in a foreign land, he quickly became typecast as villains, madmen, and foreign eccentrics. When presented with opportunities to break free of this mold, he often turned them down, convinced that audiences would not accept him in different roles. Director John Huston once offered him a substantial dramatic part that could have redefined his career, but Laurier declined, fearing it would confuse people. In his biography, Round Up the Usual Suspects, Donald Spoto observes that Laurier's greatest adversary wasn't Hollywood. It was his own lack of confidence. Personal struggles compounded his professional ones. He became addicted to morphine during the 1940s and squandered much of his earnings on addiction and dubious medical treatments. Financially unstable, he often accepted substandard pay and once had to borrow money from Boris Karloff to avoid eviction. Despite being recognized by his peers for his intellect, Laurier remained profoundly insecure, trapped in repetitive roles that slowly erased his prominence. Peter Laurier had the mind of a philosopher, but the heart of a ghost, haunting a system he never dared to challenge. Marina Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was many things: sultry, enigmatic, commanding, and she mesmerized audiences worldwide with her performances in The Blue Angel and Morocco, her image meticulously crafted under the guidance of director Joseph von Sternberg. Yet beyond the camera's gaze, Dietrich orchestrated a far more enduring performance than any she portrayed on screen. She cloaked herself in strategic ignorance, often pretending simplicity, even stupidity, to navigate an industry that desired her to be alluring, but silent. Paramount studio records from the 1930s reveal that Dietrich would frequently pretend not to understand English during contract negotiations, despite being fully fluent. When questioned on political matters, she would demur, claiming ignorance. She allowed male directors to control her lighting, blocking, and even line delivery, building a facade of passive compliance. Privately, however, she was anything but compliant. Her letters, now preserved in the Berlin State Library, reveal a razor-sharp intellect and keen strategic mind. "Men are frightened of intelligent women," she once confided to a journalist. "They prefer a whisper to a sentence." This calculated naivety came at a high price. As the studio system began to collapse in the 1950s, Dietrich found herself with few alternatives. Unlike contemporaries such as Bette Davis or Katharine Hepburn, she had not positioned herself as a producer, director, or writer. With no fallback, she embarked on a career as a touring singer, draped in sequins and crooning nostalgic standards. But the cinematic world had moved on. Dietrich was never foolish, but she allowed herself to be underestimated in order to survive, ultimately restricting her own legacy. She played the long game, but in doing so, she forfeited the chance to showcase her full potential. What endured was the mask, beautiful, enigmatic, and tragically one-dimensional. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis rose from a gritty New York upbringing to become one of Hollywood's most celebrated leading men. With his matinee idol looks and magnetic charisma, he headlined classics like Sweet Smell of Success and Some Like It Hot. Yet beneath the glittering surface, Curtis was often faulted for a lack of depth, both in his performances and in his personal life. Directors frequently observed that Curtis struggled with challenging material. Billy Wilder famously quipped that he had to coax Curtis's performance out frame by frame. Curtis's early career was defined by lightweight roles and vanity projects. Even during the peak of his stardom, he admitted his disinterest in the craft. "I never read the scripts all the way through," he confessed to a reporter in 1960. His professional misjudgments were numerous. In interviews, he once flippantly referred to Laurence Olivier as "that English guy who yells a lot." Curtis also passed up several serious, career-defining roles. opting instead for projects that highlighted his looks over his substance. His personal life mirrored his professional impulsiveness. Curtis married 6 times, often after whirlwind romances, and his name frequently appeared in headlines for petty or erratic behavior. Though he possessed raw talent and undeniable charm, Tony Curtis lacked the introspection and discipline necessary to shape a legacy of lasting greatness. Guy Madison. Guy Madison, born Robert Mosley, was discovered while working as a telephone lineman in California. One glance at his chiseled features, and he was catapulted into stardom by agent Henry Wilson. However, Madison's rapid ascent to fame was not matched by acting ability or industry savvy. He soon became the archetype of an actor who relied entirely on looks, with little instinct for the demands of a sustainable Hollywood career. Critics were consistently underwhelmed by his performances in films such as Till the End of Time and The Charge at Feather River, frequently describing his line delivery as wooden and his facial expressions as vacant. Director William Castle once remarked that Madison had the personality of a bookshelf, noting that multiple takes were often necessary just to capture a usable scene. Nonetheless, Madison became a teenage heartthrob during the 1950s. Studio insiders acknowledged that he was photogenic and easy to direct, but admitted he showed no ambition beyond simply showing up and following basic instructions. He became infamous for asking producers which way to face the camera, even well into his 4th film. His financial decisions were equally baffling. At one point, he purchased a ranch in Wyoming without staff or a business plan, which quickly collapsed. By the 1960s, Madison's career had withered, leaving him relegated to poorly dubbed European films and low-budget westerns. Guy Madison had every opportunity the industry could offer, but tragically, he had no idea how to capitalize on it.